sharing?
I'll be sharing time. 6 minutes for me, 5 minutes for Deputy O'Brien, 2 for Deputy Jerry Adams, 3 for Deputy Kenny, and 4 for Deputy Coppinger. Last count Corla, today 10,000 people filled the streets of Molesworth Street. They couldn't all even fit on Molesworth Street. There are still hundreds of students outside of the Department of the Taoiseach supporting this motion, which is brought forward by the Raise the Roof campaign, supported by the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, by the National Housing and Homelessness Coalition, by the Union of Students in Ireland, by the National Women's Council, and dozens of housing NGOs, housing activist groups, and most importantly, this is a motion that is being moved on behalf of 130,000 families who are waiting a decade and more on housing lists, 70,000 families who are in serious mortgage arrears, 10,000 people, including 4,000 children who are in emergency accommodation, a whole generation of young people and working people who are locked out of the housing market because of extortionate rents and property prices, because of renters who are afraid they could be evicted this week or next week by their landlord. This motion and the response of the government is a litmus test for Fine Gael and for Fianna Fáil as to which side are you on. Are you on the side of those hundreds of thousands of people who need a secure, affordable roof over their head, or are you on the side of vultures, property speculators, corporate landlords and other people who are obscenely profiting from the human misery that is the housing emergency? And that is the equation, Minister. The vast majority of Irish society are losing out because of this housing crisis, but a small cohort of people are watching the profits pile in because of the human misery caused by this crisis. And our motion sets forward an alternative set of proposals to the failed policies that you have pursued of depending on the private sector, of depending on vulture funds and landlords to solve this crisis. It calls for a declaration of a national housing emergency, a dramatic increase in the expenditure on public and affordable housing that will be built on public land, including an extra €1 billion in the budget that will be decided next week. It calls for an end to economic evictions into homelessness. It calls for aggressive measures to take control of empty property and unused building land that is being speculated on and hoarded by landlords and by vulture funds to make it usable for the housing that people need in this country. The motion calls for rent controls that actually control rent and bring them to affordable levels. It calls for an increase in the proportion that goes to social and affordable housing on private developments from the miserable 10%, which we're not even getting, up to a minimum of 20% on private developments and 30% on strategic development zones. And it calls for a constitutional referendum to insert the right to housing as a basic right in our constitution. Now, Minister, those are alternative proposals. They're not just a critique of your policies, they are alternative proposals. And I ask you, how do you answer those proposals? And let me put a human face on this. This is just the latest tragic story, of which we hear many. But this one, in a way, captures a lot of the themes that have come up in public debate this week. A woman, Terry O'Reilly, in her 30s, is currently living in her car in Shanganagh Cliffs in Shankill, a council estate, where she was brought up. But she's sleeping in the car. She's gone there because at least in that estate she feels safe. She served 8 years in the Irish Army, and now she is homeless. And because of a medical condition, she has to use Lycera patches, which means it is dangerous for her to go into hostels where there is active drug use, because that is a medication that is sought after by active drug users. But that is the only accommodation she's being offered, is a hostel in town where there are active drug users. The council will not even give her the right to self-accommodate, which is a miserable alternative to proper, secure housing. That's what we've come to. Somebody who served the Irish state in the army for 8 years, sleeping in a car in the estate where she was brought up. And behind every single one of the 130,000 families on the housing list, the 70,000 in mortgage arrears, the 10,000 who are homeless, there is the same kind of human story. Misery, anxiety, fear. Any government that can't deliver a secure, affordable roof over the head of its citizens is not worth the name government. So I ask you, Minister, are you going to change tack? You've had 7 years of warnings, 7 years of pleading and appeals from people on this side of the House to break your addiction to the private market, to the profiteering of these speculators and vulture funds who have swooped in on the human misery that you have facilitated. We ask you to change tack for the sake of those citizens, the hundreds of thousands of them, and the young people who are out there marching now because their future is being stolen from them if you can't secure an affordable roof over their head. I move this motion and I appeal to the government, pass this motion and listen to the people outside.